Report 1. About 2 years ago, I went to spend the weekend at a friend's farm. I've always enjoyed the tranquility of the countryside, away from the noise and frantic pace of the city. The farm was isolated, surrounded by vast fields and forests, and seemed like the perfect place to relax. But there was something about that property that no one mentioned. An old abandoned barn at the back, far from the main house. During the day, it was just another forgotten building. But at night, the barn seemed to come alive. I arrived at the farm on a sunny afternoon. My friend Andre and I spent the day exploring the property, fishing in the lake and walking through the fields. He only mentioned the barn once, saying it wasn't safe to go inside because it was full of rotten boards and rusty hardware. From a distance, the barn looked ordinary. A large structure with weathered wooden walls and a roof that seemed about to collapse. But there was something in the way Andre avoided looking at it that made me curious. When night fell, the atmosphere changed. The sky was dark, with no moon, and the only light came from the stars and the faint glow from the main house's porch. It was then that Andre gave me a strange warning. "If you hear anything coming from the barn, don't go there. I'm serious," he said, with a tone that didn't match his easygoing manner. At midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low creaking, almost like a door being slowly opened and closed. I got out of bed and looked out the window. The barn was there, standing in the darkness. But now it seemed different. The door, which had been closed earlier, was now open, swaying in the wind. I tried to ignore it and go back to bed, but the sound continued, now accompanied by another noise, something scratching the floor like wood being dragged. My curiosity won. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the barn, despite Andre's words echoing in my head. When I got close to the barn, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was almost deafening, as if the environment itself had frozen. I pushed the door open slowly, and it creaked loudly, echoing in the empty space. The interior was exactly what I expected. Piles of old hay, rusty tools, and broken boards scattered across the floor. But as I illuminated the dark corners with my flashlight, I realized I wasn't alone. There was something at the back of the barn. I couldn't distinguish what it was, but it looked like a crouched figure, motionless, as if waiting for something. "Who's there?" My voice came out low and trembling. The figure moved slightly but didn't respond. Instead, I heard a sound that made my heart stop, a heavy, uneven breath, as if it were coming from all sides at once. My flashlight began to flicker, making the atmosphere even more terrifying. Each time the light went out and came back, it seemed like the figure was getting closer. When I finally managed to focus the light again, I saw something that made me step back. The figure was not human. Its movements were awkward, almost as if it had something wrong with it. I started to back away, but I tripped over something and fell to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled, illuminating the ceiling. That's when I saw it. There were deep marks of darkness on the wooden beams, as if something had climbed up. Before I could react, I heard a rustling above me. Something was moving quickly, descending from the beams toward me. I ran as fast as I could out of the barn, not caring about the noise I was making. When I finally reached the house, Andre was already on the porch, wide-eyed. "You went in there, didn't you?" he said, not waiting for a response. The next morning, Andre told me that the farm had a history. Decades ago, a farmer disappeared in that barn, and all that returned were claw marks on the floor and ceiling. I never went back to that farm, and to this day, whenever I hear the sound of wood creaking, I remember what I saw, or what almost caught me, that night. Some abandoned places were not meant to be explored. Report 2. I have never been one to believe in stories about haunted places. I always thought they were just inventions or exaggerations to scare people. But a few years ago, I went through something in an old barn that changed my mind forever. It all started when I spent the weekend at a family friend's farm. The place was beautiful, surrounded by green fields and a quiet lake. but there was a large abandoned barn that seemed to clash with the whole landscape. The barn stood at the edge of the property, isolated from everything. During the day, it looked like just another old building with loose boards and a partially collapsed roof. But at night, the barn seemed different. My friend, Paulo, who was in charge of the place only temporarily, said, "It's not worth going there, it's dangerous," in a casual way. But the tone of his voice made it clear that there was more to the story. That night, after everyone was asleep, I decided to take a look. My curiosity was stronger than my discomfort. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly slipped out the front door. The walk to the barn felt longer than it did during the day. The wind made the trees around creak, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to echo louder than it should have. When I finally arrived, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. That gave me a chill, but I was already there, so I entered. The interior of the barn was huge but empty. Piles of rotten hay were scattered across the floor, and the smell of old wood and mold was strong. The light from my flashlight illuminated the high beams of the ceiling and the dark corners of the walls. Then I heard the sound. A light scratching, as if something was being moved across the wooden floor. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned to find the source of the noise. It seemed to come from the darkest corner of the barn. When the light finally reached that spot, I saw something that made me freeze. There was a figure standing against the wall. At first I thought it was a mannequin or something left behind, but then it moved. "Who's there?" My voice came out quieter than I expected. The figure didn't respond. It simply stepped forward, partially revealing its face. It was a person, but their face looked wrong, pale, with eyes that reflected the flashlight's light in an unnatural way. Before I could react, another sound came, this time from above. When I pointed the flashlight at the ceiling, I saw something I will never forget. On the beams of the ceiling, there were scratch marks, as if something had climbed up there. And hanging from one of them, something was slowly moving. I looked back at the figure, but it was no longer there. Now, footsteps echoed through the barn, circling around me, as if something or someone was surrounding me. I tried to run to the door, but I tripped over a pile of wood. When I got up, I heard a sound near my ear, a low, incomprehensible whisper. My hands trembled as I held the flashlight and looked in every direction. Finally, I saw the exit and ran, feeling as if something was right behind me. When I got home, Paulo was on the porch, looking worried. He didn't say anything, just told me, "I warned you not to go there." The next morning, while I was packing my things to leave, I asked him about the barn. He hesitated, but finally said, "My grandfather built that place, but after one night, no one wanted to use it again. Something is there." I never returned to the farm again. And to this day, when I hear the sound of wood creaking, I feel the same fear I felt that night in the barn. Some places should be left in the past. Report 3. I live in a small town where everyone knows everyone. Empty places or abandoned houses are usually just scenes from stories told to scare children. I never believed in that, until the night I decided to enter one of those houses. The house was at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by tall trees and a broken fence. For years it had been there, forgotten, with darkened windows and a facade covered in moss. No one knew exactly why no one lived there, but the rumors were many. It was a Friday night, and my friend Lucas and I were bored. After some gossipless chatting, he suggested we explore the old house. The idea seemed stupid, but boredom won out. We arrived there around 10 p.m. with only our flashlights and a phone to record everything. From the outside, the house looked even more sinister than I remembered. The roof was crooked, and some boards on the walls were falling apart. Lucas was excited, but I felt a growing discomfort. Still, I followed him. He pushed the door, which creaked loudly, echoing in the silent night. The interior of the house was even darker. The floor was covered in dust, and there were old furniture scattered about, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. The air was heavy, with a smell of old wood and something I couldn't identify. We explored the living room first. The walls had dark stains, and the curtains were torn. Lucas was laughing, making jokes to lighten the mood, but I couldn't relax. It was then that we heard the first sound, a faint crack coming from upstairs. "It must be the wood," Lucas said, trying to sound unconcerned. "Old houses make those noises." But something felt off. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like footsteps. Against common sense, we decided to go up the stairs. Each step creaked under our feet, and Lucas's flashlight started to flicker, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. At the top of the stairs, there was a hallway with several doors. The first one was slightly ajar, and we pushed it open slowly. It was a small room with an old bed and a wardrobe in the corner. As we explored the room, we heard another sound, this time closer. Something moved in the hallway, and the door behind us slammed shut, making the echo resonate throughout the house. Lucas tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. His flashlight flickered again, and it was at that moment I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. In the reflection of the wardrobe mirror, there was something behind us. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Lucas looked at me, confused, and wanted to know if I had seen anything. He shook his head, but his face was pale. The sound of footsteps started again, now coming up the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone wanted us to know they were coming. The door finally opened and we ran into the hallway. We tried to go down, but when we reached the top of the stairs, the flashlight went out completely. That's when we heard it. A low breath, almost a whisper coming from nearby. It was impossible to tell exactly where it was, but it felt like it was all around us. Lucas said something, but I was frozen. I felt a pressure on my shoulder, as if someone had placed a hand there. I looked back, but there was no one. We managed to run down the stairs and get out of the house. When we reached the street, we stood in silence, trying to catch our breath. We looked back at the house, and it was in that moment that we saw something we would never forget. In the second-floor window, there was a shadow standing, watching. It wasn't a person, or at least, it didn't look like one. Lucas never wanted to talk about that night again, and I have avoided going down that street to this day. Some places hold stories that should remain buried.